Hey there, this is Sean here. Welcome to this third video in the pre-launch sequence leading up to the launch of the micro-budget $5,000 Launchpad, in which there's a boot camp and a competition to win $5,000 in production financing for your micro-budget film. And these three videos are kind of training videos. Well, they're not kind of training videos, they actually are training videos with lots of great information on how to get started on writing a script and how to move forward, especially if you're stuck or you don't have an idea, or how to, give your script some soul, some heart, and so on. And so far, I've had there's been two previous training videos. The first one specifically spoke about how to construct a story, how to use the resources that you have, which will be key in terms of keeping your budget down, knowing what you have and what you don't have. If you don't have the ability to do green screen, and you don't know somebody who knows how to do green screen, don't decide to make a green screen movie and then you're trying to figure out how to do it afterwards, and suddenly your budget has gone from $10,000 to $110,000. You don't want to do that. And the second video, I talked about great three themes, powerful characters, or powerful themes and great characters, how to give your story a heart and make people want to watch it to the end because they feel some sense of stakes. They feel some sense of wanting to go on this journey with this person, and how to do that, and ways to think about it, and so on. And now in this one, I want to talk about how to bring it together in terms of structure, because you can have a great story that's rooted in a concept of how to live in the world, a theme and a character arc, and you can still end up with a script that's a mess. And it's a mess because you don't have a coherent structure that's moving you through the story in a particular kind of way. And a structure is something that all good scripts have. And I know this is a debate. Some people eschew structures like the Save the Cat structure, or the Sid Field structure, or the Robert McKee structure, and so on and so forth. And that's a very interesting debate, but I'll tell you, any script that doesn't have some kind of structure is going to be a mess if it just moves all over the place. Even the most unstructured, avant-garde, if they're a narrative story as opposed to, say, a real, true avant-garde cinema, which is maybe surrealist and is just kind of following, stream of thought and so on. If it's a narrative film, you need a structure, because the structure creates your story, because every story has this kind of structure where it moves up. There's rising action, and then there's some kind of climax where it all comes to a head, and then it kind of goes down, and there is a kind of wrapping up. Now, sometimes it'll be more complex than that, but that's the basic direction of all structure. And so the question is, how do you do that? Now, the first thing is, what happens if you don't do that? Say you totally, you're not interested in creating structure. You're just going to go with what comes into your head when it comes into your head as you're sitting down, as inspiration, as the muse lands on your shoulder and inspires you to move forward, and that's what you're going to do. Okay, that's a possibility, but I see some very common mistakes in scripts where people haven't paid enough attention to structure. And some of those mistakes are, instead of this, you have a flat structure. So instead of the sense of rising action in which there's growing tension, there's a sense that, this time it was, they spent their paycheck on gambling, and the next time the loan sharks came to their house, and the next time they kidnapped their husband or wife, and the next time they burned down their house. Each of those kind of leading to more extreme things, and that is both in terms of plot-driven stories, but also in terms of character-driven stories, as people say move through. The film I mentioned previously, A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. It's not strictly a 3-act structure. Actually, it's more of a 2-act structure, but nonetheless, and I'll come back to unconventional or alternative structures, but in the first half of the movie, you see him getting sort of deeper and deeper into his delusion. It starts off with just they're his friends, and then he starts to be drawn into a supposed conspiracy by communists, and he's helping expose the communists in the department, but really it's just a delusion. Each step is kind of leading to more severe behaviors, more severe consequential behavior, and that's giving a sense of rising action as we're moving through the story. And you need that, otherwise you have things all operating at the same level, and people get bored and they walk away. People also will get bored if there's repetition, which happens frequently. If you have the same beat over and over again, and you may think that that's sort of obvious, but it's not always obvious, because it doesn't have to be, say, the same location and the same characters. the same kind of conflict can be recurring over and over again. They're having the same argument but with different people, or coming up against the same conflict with different people or in different locations and so on. And so there's a sense of like, yeah, I've been here before, we've seen this, move the story forward. So you need to plan in advance so that that doesn't happen. Also quite common is that if people don't plan in advance is that there's no central conflict. Your story is about one thing. Now there can be multiple stories within that, but they all have to be driven by one core conflict because you're telling one story, or sometimes it's one theme, but it's one core thing. And if you don't see that, it becomes what you end up with as kind of an aimless wandering, or people kind of all over the place. One minute they're trying to, solve a robbery that took place, and then the next minute it becomes about their marriage is in crisis, and the next minute it becomes about their car broke down, or whatever series of things it is, and that becomes boring for people. I see this a lot of times in children's movies, actually, because there's an incredible, insatiable hunger for content for children's television, and so people just crank stuff out without paying due care to it. It's a little bit depressing as the father of 2 children, and you read the stuff and there's like, what's going on here? Like, what is the reason for telling this story? Not just the theme, which is one reason, but also the reason is because there's a problem they need to solve, and you need to build that into each sequence, and each conflict is about the bigger conflict. It has to be planned in from the beginning. And the final one is that it's episodic. It's a very similar idea. That scenes, while they may be rising in action, they don't feel like they're part of a flow, as a move through a journey, because every story is a journey, right? Whether it's a metaphorical journey of the person, personally through their life, through a personal crisis, or whatever, or a physical journey through space, then that implies that there is a flow, that each moment in the past is connected to the future, that the past has an impact on the next moment in the future, and that next moment has an impact on the future in front of it. And if you don't have that, you end up with a series of scenes in it that are not connected to each other, and it feels like you're watching sketch comedy, or you're watching a series of montages of just stuff happening that's not necessarily related to each other. Maybe thematically it is, but not narratively. And you need to, again, make sure that doesn't happen. Otherwise you have, somebody, has a problem with their, they can't get a promotion at work, and then the next one their car is blowing up, and the next one their plane is crashing. The story could be about bad luck and how bad luck is visited upon people for some reason. But we need to feel a thread that connects them so that it doesn't just feel like a series of disconnected elements. And that leads to the great debate. So structure. People, as I say, some people are opposed to conventional forms of structure. I understand that argument. Partly it's arisen because Hollywood has, beats to death everything that comes within its orbit. They take comics, and comics become a thing, and now they just crank out superhero movies. And at some point, people are going to be sick of superhero movies, and they'll find something else to beat the tar out of. But they do the same thing with structure. They have used the 3-act structure because it's a very powerful storytelling machine. It's a very powerful narrative machine, and they've used it not just over and over again, but they've used it in a way that has taken off all the edges so that it's become just kind of this mechanical, like a factory that cranks out, and you can time it. I watch movies with my wife, and I drive her crazy because I will, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Now, I read so many scripts that there are kind of limited number of things, there's a limited number of ways that's, heist movies, for instance. Heist movies is always a kind of similar thing. There's a heist at the beginning, we establish the team, their skills, their so on, and then at some point, a heist goes bad because they've been betrayed. That happens at the very beginning of the first Mission Impossible. But it happens in kind of every heist movie, and then they have to do another heist in order to get back what they lost through the first heist, and avenge their friends who died, and so on and so forth. So it becomes quite repetitive. But the problem is not the structure per se, it's the content that's been poured into that structure. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the end, and I'll come back to it, as I say, when I talk about alternative structures at the end, but it means that you shouldn't simply throw out the baby with the bathwater, and there's a number of good reasons for that. One, because it's a good machine to build a foundation on in terms of telling stories, in terms of rising action and figuring out beats in a story, which I'll talk about when I get to beat sheets, but also because people watch TV and they watch movies before you were around, probably before you were born, unless you're very old. And so people have built up a set of expectations about how stories unfold. And you can defy those expectations productively. But you have to know what you're doing. You have to do it in a very conscious way. Otherwise, it just feels unsatisfying for people who expect your first act to end around 20 minutes in, 20 to 24 minutes in. That's the model of the Hollywood movie. And if you don't do that, people start to get uneasy. They start to move in their seats. They get up and they go for if they're at home watching it on Netflix, they get up and they go grab a beer or a soft drink from the fridge. They start to text on their phone. You need to know that that's what you're up against and that you can't simply ignore that culture of what exists. You have to engage with it in a way that's productive and is going to make people feel like you're messing with them in a pleasurable way as opposed to you're boring me kind of way. So you need to know that and not pretend that those great expectations don't exist. So how do you plan? Because it's one thing to say, I want a structure, and it's another thing to do it. Now, when I first started writing, I just wrote. I wrote a whole novel without planning out in advance, like 500-page novel or something. And I can assure you, I will send it to you if you'd like to read it, but I can assure you that it sucks because I just went all over the place. And from week to week, I had a different idea of what the story was about, where it was going, and so on. And so I'm just as writing as rewriting, going back and fixing stuff up when you're finished your draft of your script. So writing is also pre-writing. It's planning. You need to plan in advance because you don't want to get 90 or 100 pages into your script and discover that, in fact, your script doesn't make sense and you have to start from the beginning. It's much easier to take a 5-page beat sheet or a 15-page treatment and revise them and change them, pulling out points, moving them around, and so on, than it is to change a much longer thing. So you want to plan in advance. And the first place you want to go is you want to know your story and you want to know your themes. Now, I talked about those in the first two training videos, but it's worth revisiting them briefly because part of how you're going to get to know your story and your themes, and this also helps with overcoming writer's block, is you're going to tell people about it. You're going to have this story in your head. You've come up with this idea that's a combination of things from your own life because you understand them, emotionally what you went through in those moments, and you have this exciting idea of something from the real world that's going on, and you've merged them together in this really awesome, masala that's going to be really fabulous, and you've figured out a theme. You know what? What's really kind of interesting about this is how it reveals this about human existence, how it reveals the role of love, how it reveals the importance of thinking beyond just yourself, or how it reveals that you need to forgive in order to move forward, and so on, whatever your theme happens to be. Now you're going to take that, and before you write a word down, before you plan any further, you're going to tell people about it. And I know some people are paranoid about ideas being stolen. Seriously, do not worry about that. There are only so many ideas in the world. The idea that you have has probably been thought about by somebody else. I once got 2 scripts from different continents that were both kind of heist stories, and they were almost identical. It was the weirdest thing. 2 people who didn't know each other. That kind of thing happens. And the more fresh you can make yours, the more you defy the Hollywood norm, the less likely that's going to be the case. But nonetheless, maybe in LA, I don't know. But I have never been concerned about people stealing my ideas. Nobody's ever stolen my ideas. Nobody I know has ever had ideas stolen because it's a lot of work to write a script. Really, if somebody wants your idea, why don't they just let you write it and offer you a $1 option, which happens most of the time in most indie settings, or just pay you rather than paying somebody else. If they hire a writer, they're going to have to pay them $50,000 or $100,000 if they're going to contract them, or they're going to get somebody else to do what you're already doing. It usually doesn't make sense for people to do that. So, and most of the people you're going to know are your friends who you work with and so on, unless you're moving amongst studio executives and so on who you don't trust. It's probably not going to be a big deal. So sit down with people and tell them your story and see how it flies with them. Does it excite them? Do they get bored? Are they looking at their watch? Do they check their phone? Do they call for the bill? How are they reacting to it? Do they get into it and start offering you suggestions? And it's a really useful way to begin to test it out in a non-pressure kind of setting, the way that your story is going to unfold before you sit down and write it. And then it becomes a much higher pressure because you're trying to figure out your plot points. So it's about this guy, and he wanted to learn how to fly an airplane, but he wasn't allowed because he was cross-eyed, and so he decided to make a contraption that would allow him to see properly on his head and build his own airplane. And then he builds this airplane, and he flies it, but it crashes. You're going to tell that to them, and you're going to find that there's holes, things you haven't thought of, how you're going to get from this moment when he builds the contraption for his head that allows him to see clearly with full 3D depth perception, to the moment where he builds the airplane or whatever. You're going to feel those things as gaps as you're trying to tell your story to your friends, family, coworkers, or whatever, and it's going to help you to fill it out. So do that repeatedly, and thinking about the theme that you want to explore. Start to do that. Maybe make notes to yourself afterwards, what worked, what didn't, where the gaps are, but mostly just go with the flow of testing out your story. And once you've done that, then when you feel confident in your story, then you want to sit down to a beat sheet, because it's going to be much less painful. Beat sheets are very difficult. In fact, I think that they're more difficult than going the first draft on your script, because now you have to invent from whole cloth a whole world that's got to exist and has to make sense. All the parts have to fit together and make sense. So it's better to do that than to go to draft, which is right away, can be the worst way to go about it. But it's still going to be tough. And when you sit down and you want to write out a beat sheet, and you're going to write out a beat sheet, and you're going to time things, like you need to know where things happen. And I use a kind of modified version of the Save the Cat beat sheet, and it's timed out. In the first 10 to 12 pages, I'm going to be introduced to the world, the rules of the world, because when you meet the world, you can't change the rules of the world halfway through. You can't have suddenly magic appear on page 50, because then it no longer becomes a magical fantasy story. Instead, it becomes Deus Ex Machina, where you're cheating to solve prop problems with magic, instead of it being an organic part of the world. So you need to make sure that the rules of your world are established in the introduction. In the up to page 12, we meet the character, we get a sense of their dilemma, we get a sense of the theme we're going to explore. We use the opening image to really, drive home the dilemma and the what kind of world we're entering. And then you get to the catalyst. The catalyst is the beginning of things twisting around. I often talk about the movie Drive. In Drive with Ryan Gosling, you see, for instance, that he's falling in love with the woman down the hall, and their husband is out of jail, and that changes the rules of the world. And now the next 10 pages are about how he reacts to that. That's called the debate. During the debate, you're figuring out how you're going to deal with this new situation in the world that you've created, the sort of beginning of a crisis. And the end of Act 1 is the decision, whether it's imposed or whether it's freely embarked upon for half understood reasons, usually. This journey. So in the Matrix with Neo, he meets Trinity around page 12. And then he, resists going with Morpheus and the terrorists, and he is taken by the Agent Smith. And then at the end of the first act, he agrees to eat the red pill and goes into the world of the Matrix. And now we're in a whole new thing. And that's going to happen around page 20 or 24 of your story. Because if you go on too long, as I say, people get bored and start twitching in their seats and texting and checking out Facebook and so on. And you're going to do that with all the different sections of your story. Page 30, around there, you're probably going to introduce some kind of B story, a subplot in there, often a relationship between the main protagonist and a secondary character that's going to also describe the theme and the character arc in a sort of minor note kind of way. The midpoint is not quite an act break, but something is going to happen, something's going to change. Often that can be in a heist movie. It can be that the heist that goes wrong, and now the bad guys are coming to get the crooks that we love or whatever, and they decide that they have to. This is the moment they decide they have to get their vengeance and create a new team that's going to steal the money back and take vengeance for their comrades who fell in the betrayal and so on. And often the midpoint has a relationship with around the end of the second act, a period of reversal, where things all go wrong. They start to look after the midpoint, we get into the real battle, because before that it's just kind of the initiation and the training period. In the Matrix, it's literally training. Neo is training to become the one. In Drive, Ryan Gosling is learning that he can't get out of this easily by just kind of brushing it off the usual way. He's going to have to become a bigger person, take on a bigger struggle if he's going to survive what has now been thrust upon him. And then the second half, after the midpoint, is the battle begins in earnest. Now the bad guys are closing in. Things are becoming more intense. That ramp upwards is now kind of escalating even further. The altitude, I guess, the angle of attack is increasing. If it was going up like this, now it's going to go up like this, and things are going to become more intense. That things mean business now in that second half. And then towards the end of the second half, there's a reversal of some kind. Now, if the midpoint was negative, this is the relationship. If the midpoint was a negative midpoint, a betrayal that happens, for instance, the end of the second act is usually the opposite of that. It usually is that something good will happen. They'll solve the crime. But it's usually a false positive in the sense, because the movie's not over, right? They think they've solved the crime. You know, at the end of the second act of the movie Seven, Kevin Spacey turns himself in to Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, and it's like, wow, they've caught the bad guy. But it's not the end. It just seems like a good thing, and in fact, it's going to be a much deeper pit when the real truth is revealed. So if it's the opposite, if it's a positive at the midpoint, so-and-so kisses the girl, for instance, or the boy. At the turning point, they're going to break up in some fashion, and they're going to have to figure out how to change themselves in order to get them back, and that's going to be the struggle of the third act, is bringing that around after a period of darkness, after a period of when all is lost, everything has fallen apart. And that's going to happen probably in a 110-page script. That reversal is going to happen around page 74, 75. It's going to last for about 15 pages. In other words, 15 minutes of screen time, because you're talking 1 minute per page. And then there's going to be some kind of climax, some kind of final confrontation with the truth, final confrontation with the evil person, final confrontation with the drug abuse, or the partner who you met while you were doing drugs, and now you got out and they stayed in and they've overdosed, and now you're going to get them out, or vice versa. There's going to be some kind of final conflict that's going to test the resolve of the hero or heroine to transform themselves, because they will have to transform themselves and come into sync with the theme, as I've talked about in the previous one. This is about, for most of the story, they're struggling in the old way. They're struggling to achieve this goal, but they're using the old tools. And the final transformation of the character, because they have to be transformed in order to come in alignment with the theme that you're exploring, that final transformation has to be, the old ways are failing. They cannot continue in the old ways no matter how hard they try. They tried as hard as they could, and they collapsed, and they went into this reversal, and now they're going to have to transform themselves and approach the problem in a new way that they haven't thought of before. And that's going to bring you to the conclusion, and then you can kind of wrap things up and have the epilogue or whatever. So you're going to lay that out in a series of beats, literally like action-oriented paragraphs of no more than 3 sentences, because ultimately, once you've got that beat sheet of 5 or 10 pages, you can maybe transfer it onto onto a board like this, or onto index cards. You can move it around, because you may find that the beat that you put in the second act is really an initiation training kind of beat that's not as high stakes as another beat that's in the first half, so maybe you'll switch them. So you're going to play around, moving around those beats until you find the kind of optimum rising arc that's going to get you there. And once you have that beat sheet, that's not the end of your planning. You're not ready to go to draft yet, because you want this to be as bulletproof, as foolproof as possible. Then you want to create a treatment. And a treatment is really about creating a connective tissue between those beats, expanding them, putting in bits of dialogue, building it out from about 5 pages to maybe 15 pages, where you basically turn it into kind of a short story where we see the linkages. Because the beats will be like, Frank goes to his office and finds everybody dead. Frank goes home and finds his family dead. Frank, goes to the police, and the police aren't interested in his case. But there's going to be stuff that happens in between that. Maybe Frank makes phone calls to his boss, who's not in the pile of bodies in his office, and to find out what's going on, or he follows something else. So you need to start to figure out that connective tissue. Now that you've got all these awesome beats, you're going to figure out how to link them to each other, and the treatment is through that. And once you've done that, you've created this 15-page document or so, and you've revised it. You're always revising as you go along. Then you can go to draft. And now you're going to know how you get from point A to point B. And that, ironically, is not going to take away the spontaneity in your storytelling. It's going to add to it, because now you can go off the road and you can explore little side channels now and again. And you know where you're going back to. You're not kind of like, whoa, where's the road? And then you go off and you find yourself in a dead end after 15 or 20 pages and you have to throw all that out. Instead, you're going to go off and you can come back and find your way back towards the ending because you've planned it out in advance. It's much more freeing, and you're much less likely to develop writer's block at the draft stage. It's better to have writer's block here, where you can then just, there are different strategies you can employ to overcome writer's block, just talking through the story and just writing out scenes randomly and so on. But it's tough when you're in the middle of a draft and you're trying to get to the end. But when you've got a beat sheet and a treatment, you know what comes next. So you can, if worst comes to worst, you can just focus on the scene you're writing, having faith that you have a logical progression right ahead of you, and when you get to that scene, you can write that scene as well, and so on and so forth. And this kind of planning is really going to help you out. It's really essential to writing a good script. Now, I'm going on quite long, and it's tough to do it otherwise, to be honest with you. But the last thing I want to talk about is alternative structures, because some people do want more advanced structures and more alternative structures. And you can use this, and I talk about this in more detail in the launch, in the boot camp part of the program. But you can create alternative structures using the beat sheet, because you can take that beat sheet. It's such an awesome, powerful tool, and you can do things, which is, for instance, what I do. I'm really interested in 2-act structures now, because I think they allow us to explore the history of conflict in ways that shows that conflict doesn't exist just now. It has a context to it. That's something I'm kind of really interested in. And so what I do is I just literally do 2 beat sheets that are two stories, 2 3-act structures, and I put them side by side in the way that they're related to each other. You can see that kind of structure, for instance, in some really awesome movies. Full Metal Jacket has a 2-act structure. Melancholia has a 2-act structure, for instance. A Beautiful Mind has a 2-act structure where you get the conflict in the beginning evolving that then spins around and takes us into another 3-act conflict that's coming. And you can just use 2 beat sheets side by side. Sometimes I'll write complicated stories that move around in time, and I'll use 1 beat sheet and I'll use different colors for the different moments in time, and it allows me to keep track of it. So there are different ways that you can approach structure using something that is designed for a 3-act structure that will still allow you to keep the story on the rails and not get lost and not create something that doesn't make sense, or where there's logical problems and emotional problems and drama problems and so on. So I really, really, really can't emphasize strongly enough the need to plan in advance and have a clear structure of planning, a clear approach to planning in order to create the best script possible for your awesome story that's got a profound theme, that's going to change the world, and that's going to throw your career into high gear. So really, I recommend you do this. Now, Monday, just to wrap this up, Monday is the launch of the Microbudget Launchpad, and it's going to be a registration that lasts just for 5 days, from Monday to Friday, and it will open at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's Los Angeles time. So I don't know, wherever you happen to be in the world, you can set it by then. It will open at that time, and I'll talk more about that in the next video. That's to tell you what's going to happen and how the program is going to run. But I hope to see you then. In the meantime, please, if you have any questions about any of this, put them below the video. If you want to share it with other filmmakers, please feel free, or you can drop me a line at admin@microbudgetfilmlab.com, and I get back to everybody usually within a couple days. Sometimes the same day if I'm happen to be sitting at my computer procrastinating my own screenwriting work. So I hope to see you on Monday. Join me in the bootcamp program, and I hope to talk to you further about your projects and how to move them forward. So let's get going.